Good afternoon or good morning or whatever the time is wherever you are, and welcome all to this Book at Lunchtime event co-organized with Columbia University's Harriman Institute and the Russian Library. My name is Professor Wes Williams and I'm the director here at Torch, the Oxford Research Centre in the Humanities. Book at Lunchtime, as regulars will know, is Torch's flagship event series, taking the form of fortnightly bite-sized book discussions with a range of commentators. In normal times, those bite-sized discussions would also be accompanied by sandwiches in our seminar room, but of course, for the past year and more, we've moved largely online. This has the advantage that we have a whole range of folk from beyond Oxford who are able to join us, as indeed we do have today. You're all very welcome. Our book today is Journey from St. Petersburg to Moscow, originally composed by Alexander Radishev and newly and expertly translated by Professor Andrew Kahn and Professor Irina Reifman. I'm delighted to welcome both of these eminent and indeed award-winning translators here today, and to say that they will be joined by two similarly exciting interlocutors in the shape of Professor Zofia Stemplovska and Dr. Oliver Reddy, who will chair the session. Just a few words about our chair. Oliver Reddy is Research Fellow in Russian Literature and Culture at St. Antony's College here in Oxford. He's writing a book about Nikolai Gogol and is continuing to translate the novels and the non-fiction of the late Vladimir Sharov. He's on the editorial board of the Russian Library, the series in which this translation of Journey from St. Petersburg to Moscow is published, and he will, as I said, be chairing today's session. So without further ado, I'll hand the torch over to you, Oliver.
Thank you very much, Wes. I'll begin by asking the question that I think will be on many people's minds who've tuned into this event, to ask whether this is a good or even appropriate moment to be discussing a work of Russian literature as Kharkiv burns and a seemingly never-ending military convoy bears in down on Kyiv. Well, we felt, all of us on the panel and Torch, strongly that it was appropriate, not least because of the nature of the book that we're going to be discussing. Journey from St. Petersburg to Moscow is one of the most courageous, most morally indignant works in the Russian canon, which speaks out searingly against arbitrary violence, social injustice, imperialism, and tyranny, while acknowledging the narrator's own implication in some of those structures. And for more than a century, this book was erased from Russian history and culture for doing precisely those things. And as I was reading this remarkable translation, many of the sentences were electrified by the current moment. I'll quote just one series of rhetorical questions that the author asks about the actions 2 centuries earlier of Ivan the Terrible and his violent assault on the city of Novgorod, famous for its historic democratic traditions. By what right did he rage against them? What right did he have to annex Novgorod? Was it because the first grand princes of Russia lived in this city, or because he styled himself the Tsar of all Russia? Well, the publication of Journey from St. Petersburg to Moscow in 1790 came at a huge personal cost to its author, as we will see. This is only the second translation into English. The first was done some time ago. And its publication in the Russian Library, published by Columbia University Press, accords closely with our aims on the editorial board for the series, namely to focus on works either previously unavailable in English or ripe for new translations. And in doing so, to demonstrate the breadth and the global importance of the Russian literary tradition beyond the authors who are so well established in English and beyond the territories we associate with that tradition in a narrow sense. So just to take one example from post-Soviet literature, we have the novel Klotsvog by the late Margarita Hemlin, whose exploration of the Ukrainian Jewish experience during the years of the Second World War and the Soviet Union is painfully pertinent now against the backdrop of the explosion yesterday next to the Babin Yar Holocaust Memorial Center. It was translated by Lisa Hayden and published in 2019. Last month, this translation of Journey from St. Petersburg to Moscow by Andrew Kahn and Irina Reifman won the prize in the category of literary translation, awarded by the Association of American Teachers of Slavic and East European Languages. The judges end their citation with the words, "This is the translation to introduce new readers to this historically important, timely plea to let the blinders fall from our eyes, transform our world, and live up to our ideals." So without further ado, let me introduce now the co-translators of this book, who also contribute a substantial introduction. So Andrew Kahn is a professor of Russian literature in the University of Oxford and a fellow of St. Edmund Hall. He has published widely on Russian poetry, notably books on Pushkin and Mandelstam. He's also a specialist in the 18th century and has translated other key works from the same period, the late 18th century. His translation of Nikolai Karamzin's The Letters of a Russian Traveler was published by Liverpool University Press in 2003. While working together with Kelsey Rubin Detlev, he has translated Catherine the Great's Selected Letters, published in Oxford World's Classics. And we'll be hearing more, I'm sure, about Catherine the Great in this talk, in this discussion. With Rubin Detlev, he's also established a pilot digital database of Catherine's correspondence. Irina Reifman is professor in the Department of Slavic Languages at Columbia University. So thank you, Irina, for joining us so early in the day. Her interests lie in the area of 18th and 19th century Russian literature, particularly cultural history, the semiotics of culture, censorship. And her publications include the book, How Russia Learned to Write, Literature and the Imperial Table of Ranks, an essential study on how state service influenced Russian writers' self-image. Must also mention that she's also a co-editor with Professor Kahn and two other scholars, Stephanie Sandler and Mark Lipovietsky, of the recent History of Russian Literature, published by Oxford University Press, an indispensable resource for tutors and students alike, and of course for the wider public. So it's customary at these books at lunchtime to bring in an interdisciplinary perspective, and today that feels especially welcome. So I'm delighted to have Professor Zofia Stemplovska on the panel. Professor Stemplovska is a contemporary political philosopher and the Asa Briggs Fellow at Worcester College here at Oxford. She writes on her webpage at the Department of Politics and International Relations that I am mostly interested in the problem of what people owe to each other as a matter of domestic, global, and historical justice. So with the introductions done, let's turn to the book. Andrew, if I can begin with you. I mean, even within Russian studies, this book is arguably more famous than it is read and little known outside our field. So could I invite you to please to introduce Alexander Radishev and indeed this book for us? Thank you. You're muted, Andrew, at the moment.
Sorry, thank you very much. Thank you very much for the opportunity to meet like this and the opportunity to speak about Radishev. So Alexander Radishev, his dates were 1749 to 1802, is the second most famous figure of the Russian Enlightenment or the 18th century in Russia. The first is Catherine the Great, whose enemy he became. They had got off on the right foot when in 1766, Radishev was one of a select group of 12 young members of the nobility to be sent to Leipzig University to further their education. The foundation for Radishev's knowledge of a wide range of key ideas about the body and soul, as well as about political economy, rhetoric, and the law, was laid during his Leipzig years. His period in Leipzig was formative, not only educationally, but politically and emotionally as well. And I'll say something about that very shortly. By profession, he went on to become a civil servant who worked for Catherine the Great in various capacities. At court, he contributed to drafting constitutional reform and customs tax legislation, experiences that framed his utopian political ideals and a profound knowledge and tempered a profound knowledge of jurisprudence and natural law with a pragmatic understanding of how the Russian Empire worked. When the government passed gubernatorial reforms in 1780, Radishev was seconded to the director of St. Petersburg Customs, assuming oversight for trade entering the port at St. Petersburg, in which capacity he was said to have commanded the respect of his colleagues for his incorruptibility, by contrast with the venality of officialdom, much illustrated in the work we're talking about today. He made steady progress up the ranks, and in 1789, he was promoted and designated Director of St. Petersburg Customs. So at the time of the publication of this work, he was a high-flying civil servant, an indispensable advisor on drafting legislation, an expert on taxation and commercial treaties. His arrest intervened before he actually assumed that post. Culturally, Radishev made his mark as a pamphleteer, novelist, philosophical essayist, poet, and letter writer. His writings include a pioneering unconventional biography, The Life of Fyodor Vasilievich Ushakov, about his friend and classmate at Leipzig University. It is a sort of secular hagiography that is explicit about their collusion in a student rebellion at Leipzig against an oppressive minder. And it also details candidly Ushakov's death from venereal disease. It ends with 5 letters about a work of radical enlightenment, Helvetius's De l'Homme, supposedly authored by Ushakov, but possibly Radishev's own work. Other writings, such as the historical song, reflect his knowledge of theories of history, and most impressive of all, in my opinion, is the treatise on man, immortality, and mortality, a work he wrote on his way into exile in Siberia. He is an interdisciplinary thinker who searches restlessly for the right literary forms. The Journey is his most famous work, notorious almost as much for its difficult style as for its history of composition and publication. It is a work of travel literature cast in 25 chapters, each named for a postal station of an itinerary along which the main narrator makes his own observations or meets all sorts of characters who tell their stories. Radishev took advantage of the flexible form of travel literature to produce a work that was quasi-documentary, quasi-fictional, quasi-essayistic, to offer what has often been thought of as a radical critique of Russia, of absolute power, and serfdom in particular, as the basis of the country's political economy. And I think Irina will have some words in a few minutes on its scandalous first publication and reception.
Thank you very much. Yes. By the way, I should have mentioned to the attendees, please, if you have questions, do put them in Q&A, and we will try to get to them in the second part of the session. Yeah, as Professor Khan says, this is a work of travel literature, but it's absolutely no ordinary travelogue, nor is it consistent, which is what makes it so interesting, partly in its literary style or in its language. And I wonder, Irina Reifman, as one of the translators, whether I could bring you in to say something about the form of this work and indeed its language and style.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you everyone who is present and who has organized this event. As Andrew and Oliver mentioned, the form of Radishev's book is deceptively simple. It is a travelogue. So many other travelogues, real and fictional, were produced in the 18th century. At the same time, it is strikingly innovative, even idiosyncratic. Its narrator pretends to be Radishev, but of course he is not. The language in which the travelogue is written seems to be that of an inept writer. But again, it is deliberate, artfully constructed, and changes from perfectly readable to very difficult depending on the content of the concrete chapter. The question of form relates to many questions about who Radishev was as a writer and social philosopher. As Andrew has mentioned, he was a strikingly innovative writer in many different ways, not only in his travelogue. He experimented with genres, with metrics, with language, and those experiments usually had to do with the question of how to get through to the reader, how to convince the reader, change the reader, how to affect the reader's sensibilities. He believed in affective nature of human beings, and his art targeted that affective nature to achieve change. So I produce back to Andrew to continue to discuss the book. Thank you.
Right. Thank you. So I've been asked to place the book in its intellectual and literary context, and I'll say a few words. Radishev came of age at a transformative moment in the history of Russian intellectual and cultural life. The period saw the development of a literary language away from the ecclesiastical language that had dominated until the 1750s or so. And this was a period in which Russia saw a rapid creation of a secular literature, without which the 19th century, for many people, the heart of Russian literature would have been impossible. The influence of the church, weakened by Peter I initially, Peter the Great, was further reduced and police and church censorship was only intermittent in Catherine's reign, at least until around 1790. The expansion of print culture also had a powerful impact with the proliferation of newspapers and literary journals, translations from many languages across all genres, scientific as well as literary and historical, and there were also works of political economy, and in fact there was even an official sort of debating society called the Free Economic Society that considered physiocratic and other contemporary theories of political economy and structural reform. Institutionally, the foundation of Moscow University in 1755, outside the religious academies, produced new generations of able, literate young gentry. Some became state functionaries who were also amateur writers. Others became what we might call culture workers, who enabled a substantial expansion in the world of theatre, music, publishing, and translation. All enterprises supported and encouraged by Catherine outside the court as engines of progress and even enlightenment. The Academy of Sciences, founded by Peter the Great originally, was a hub of experimental science and had attracted scientists and mathematicians of world renown. Instrumental in all these changes, as I've said, was Catherine herself, portrayed in the period as a beacon of reason, not only a propagandistic use of image making. She was a pen pal of Voltaire. She hosted Diderot for 9 months in St. Petersburg in 1774. She built upon the legacy of Peter the Modernizer. She was also locked in rivalry with Frederick the Great of Prussia for territorial advantage and cultural hegemony. She valued the idea of Peter's legacy as symbolic capital on which she could draw for legitimation in a reign marked by enormous changes of which she herself became the symbol and image. From the start of her reign, Catherine was vigorous in rebutting criticism of Russia. In particular, she refuted the view held chiefly by French visitors to the country that Russia was an Asiatic power. As she wrote to Voltaire on 31st of March, 1770, in general, our nation has the most fortunate proclivities in the world. There is nothing easier than giving them a taste for what is good and reasonable. When this nation becomes better known in Europe, people will recover from the many errors and prejudices that they have about Russia. It might be thought noteworthy that the bulk of her legislative reforms and cultural initiatives, which took place in the 1770s and 1780s, occurred after the Russian Empire was rocked in the early 1770s by a massive peasant rebellion in the south, the Pugachev revolt. Over.
Right. Thank you, Andrew. So it's precisely against this context you've just described so artfully of Catherine's reign and its claims for itself as encouraging intellectual debate, intellectual discussion, freedom of expression, that we have this book by Radishev, which deals so frankly with, for example, relations between master and serf, with the nature of crime, the law, and yet this book would be banned very shortly after its appearance. And so, Irina, I wonder if you can say something, please, about picking up on what Andrew's been talking about Catherine, about how her reception of this book, its reception in general, and its banning.
Oh, thank you, Oliver. Yes, indeed, as Andrew just mentioned, like naming Catherine the first most famous philosopher of enlightenment in the 18th century, and this is absolutely true. She was, and Radishev, we must notice, grew up and matured during the best years of Catherine's reign. Catherine sent him, Andrew mentioned that too, with a sizable group of other young people to Leipzig University, where he was exposed to contemporary social philosophy, among other things. Later, thanks to Catherine's 1783 ukaz allowing private ownership of presses, he obtained his own press and used it to print his book. He likely did not expect that it's banning and Catherine's almost violent reaction. I do not think that Catherine was right to see the book as an attempt to foment disobedience and discord, even though those who read the book could, remember the pages where he describes the almost popular uprising. Radishchev meant the book as a warning, perhaps wanted to remind the readers about the Pugachev revolt about 15 years earlier. Catherine's reaction could and should be understood in the historical context. The Pugachev uprising that I just mentioned, and of course the French Revolution. It should be noted that Radishchev did not approve of the Pugachev revolt, and he probably did not approve of the French Revolution as well. At least he found some things really wrong with this, including the restoration of the censorship in the post-revolutionary France. So it is possible that Catherine took the book not only in this rather unsettling context for her reign, but also maybe in a personal way, as a personal affront, the disregard for her efforts to bring enlightenment to Russia. And as Andrew mentioned, these efforts were not trivial. She was trying on all fronts to enlighten Russia, even though sometimes it can look to us as not an honest effort, but it was, I think, for the most part, really honest effort to do this. Oliver, back to you.
Thank you very much. But I think at this stage, now that we've got a sense of the context and the author's background, how this book came to be written, how it was received, it would be good to bring it alive by actually hearing an excerpt from it and getting a sense of the texture and the voice of the narrator. And Andrew, you volunteered to read a paragraph, albeit a long paragraph, and to set it in context, please, if you would.
Well, if I don't do it well, I won't face the same sentence that Radishchev. Radishchev was actually sentenced to death. He was stripped of his noble status and sentenced to death before being exiled to Siberia. So we might come on to those details. The book was confiscated. All 650 copies that he printed on his hand press were confiscated, many of them burned, and they became a bibliographic rarity. But the passage that we've chosen comes from chapter 10, in which the traveler meets an acquaintance who tells a horrific story about an incident in which he'd been involved. The son of a landowner exercised his droit de seigneur and violently raped a young peasant girl. Her fiancé and his brothers come to her rescue. A melee ensues. The landowner and his sons are killed, and the peasants are brought to trial. The friend serves as an advocate for the defense of the peasants and champions their rights to self-defense, and he identifies popular violence as a democratic instrument. And the speech from which I'm going to read an excerpt comes at a moment when he's accused of betraying his fellow members of the jury in defending these serfs. So they attack him and try to persuade him, well, as it were, their foreman or their overseer tries to persuade him to change his mind. And so we get an account of incredible pressure that he's put under. So the Governor General counted on discovering in me either a timorous soul or mental weakness. He took aim at both of these in his speech, but I consider it unnecessary to paraphrase for you all that his arrogance, sense of power, and overweening confidence in his astuteness in learning imparted to his eloquence. To his arrogance, I replied with indifference and calm. To his power, with firmness, matching logical argument for argument. And I spoke for a long time with icy control. But in the end, a shaken heart spilled out its surplus of feeling. The clearer the audience's acquiescence became, the more emotional my speech. In a firm voice and ringing enunciation, I finally cried out, "Each person is born into this world the equal of any other. We all have similar limbs. We all have reason and will. Man, considered therefore outside society, is a being dependent on nobody else for his own deeds. But he puts a limit on these, consents not to subordinate himself to his own will alone, and becomes obedient to the commands of other human beings. In a word, becomes a citizen. For the sake of what cause does he restrain his desires? For what purpose does he set a power over himself? Unlimited in the exercise of his willpower, why does he limit it through obedience? For his own sake, says reason. For his own sake, says an inner voice. For his own sake, says wise legislation. It follows that where it is not in his interest to be a citizen, there is no citizen. It follows, therefore, that whoever wants to deprive him of the advantage of being a citizen is his enemy. He seeks in the law defense and retribution against his enemy. If the law either does not have the power to defend him, or does not wish to do so, or lacks the power to help him immediately in his present woe, then the citizen uses his natural right of defense, preservation, welfare. For the citizen, insofar as he has become a citizen, does not cease to be a person whose first duty, stemming from his organism, is preservation, defense, welfare. The assessor murdered by the peasants violated with his bestial actions their right as citizens. At that moment, when he condoned the violence of his sons, when to the heartache of the betrothed he added rape, when he threatened punishment because they resisted his hellish domination, at that moment the law intended to protect the citizen was remote and its efficacy was negligible. That was when the law of nature awakened, and the insulted citizen's power, which positive law does not take away when he is injured, came into force. The peasants who killed the bestial assessor are innocent before the law. Based on the conclusions of reason, my heart acquits them, and the death of assessor, while violent, was just. Let no one conceive of basing political decisions on prudence, basing the condemnation of the murder of the assessor who gasped his last breath in such malice on the desire for social calm. No matter the station of life into which he was fated to have been born, the citizen is and always will be a person. And for as long as he is a person, the law of nature, as the abundant source of benefits, will never dry up in him. And one who dares to damage what is in him a natural and indestructible property is a criminal. Woe unto him if the civil law does not punish him. He will be tainted, marked out as despicable among his fellow citizens, and every person of adequate strength should avenge the injury done by him. I fell silent. The Governor General did not address a word to me. Now and again he raised toward me sullen looks, charged with the rage of impotence and malignancy of revenge. Everyone remained silent, expecting that I would be taken into custody for offending against all privileges. Now and again, from the lips of the servile, one heard a rumbling of indignation. Everyone averted their eyes from me. Terror, it seems, gripped those standing near me. They imperceptibly withdrew, as though from someone afflicted with a fatal plague. Fed up with the spectacle of such a mixture of arrogance and the most craven baseness, I departed from this assembly of lickspittles.
Thank you. Thank you, Andrew. That was one of many compelling passages, but compellingly read. This seems, I think, a good moment really to bring in Zofia Stemplowska. Obviously, you're coming at this book from a different area of expertise, but that's precisely why these books are published in the series, to bring in other readers from outside our area. And yeah, we'd be really fascinated to hear what your response to this book. Thank you.
So in my remarks, I will in fact address directly parts of this passage, but first let me thank you. I am coming from contemporary political philosophy, but this translation is wonderful, and it was simply amazing reading this book in English. I'm extremely grateful to be part of this today. I want to very briefly comment on three things that struck me. One is what I call the problem of responsibility. Then more broadly, the philosophy of social contract, where the book fits into it. And then finally, also very briefly, on the mode of delivery of political philosophy through a novel. So the problem of responsibility is one about who is responsible for the terrible corruption that the protagonist witnesses throughout the book. And there are many targets, but corrupt officials, although condemned, are also shown to be trapped because they're encouraged in their corruption by the system that they encounter. And serfs are often shown to be excused for what they do. So the one charge that I found that was not fully deflected was against the ruler. And it comes in a long sequence in the novel, where Radishev considers the fact that the ruler may be uninformed because of the trappings of power, meaning that no one wants to deliver bad news and also wants to profit from the situation of ignorance. But he says that the ruler has a duty to inform himself, or I guess herself, in the context that he's writing. And so my initial reaction on finding this was that this might have explained why Catherine the Great was reacting with such hostility to this. And so I was in effect puzzled that he was puzzled by the hostility the novel received. But I've since come to think that on reflection, I can understand his puzzlement, because appealing to the ruler to inform himself, herself, as he does, is an act of profound trust in the moral compass of the ruler. And we can think of other rulers of Russia to whom no one would think of appealing with information. They do what they do, even though the information is readily available to them. So I think I've changed my mind somewhat about the reaction, and I am now as puzzled as he was. The second, I wanted to briefly say something about the social contract tradition. I think it is brought out in the passage that we just heard.
Zofia, could I just interrupt you 1 second to make sure that your mic isn't covered? We can hear you, but sometimes it comes and goes. Perhaps staying closer to the microphone will help, just because sometimes when you move away, we lose audibility a bit.
Of course.
Thank you.
Is this better? Yeah. I was making a point that some rulers of Russia don't have a moral compass. So the social contract tradition that is brought out in the passage that we heard, to be clear, sovereignty, he argues, rests with the law, not with the people, rests with the law, but not the law, as we heard, as it exists, but the moral law, the correct moral law. So people have their right, in his view, it seems, well, they would be excused were they to revolt against oppression, and that comes across vividly in the many passages, but it's also not the case that he, in my view, is advocating revolution. Revolution, as I saw it, was seen as something that would be excused if it's done out of necessity, but what really should be done is the undertaking of progressive reforms. And here, it's very striking that in contrast to a lot of the tradition of political philosophy, he is taking the problem of transition extremely seriously. He suggests that the progressive reforms have to come in steps. He's very explicit about it, but also the novel brings out his despair at the problem of uncoordinated reform. I don't think he is explicit about that, but I think the examples that he gives do illustrate it. Repeatedly, he offers examples of some people refusing donations of money from their protagonist, because were they to receive more than others have, they might be subject to theft, or they might be in effect punished. So reform has to be coordinated. It's going to be tricky. It's going to be difficult to know what to do. And this hesitation come across throughout, as well as this emphasis that there is not going to be a perfect solution that we will find. Anything we find is going to be unstable. One thing that he suggests might introduce stability were we to move into a better direction is virtue. And so there are passages where he emphasizes that virtue should not be given up for individual gain. Of course, it should also not be given up in order to follow the wrong law. And again, in the context of what happens after the publication of the book, these passages become very interesting to interpret. My understanding is that at least partially he did disavow some of this in order to lessen his punishment. And I think an initial reaction might be that therefore he was just being naive in saying we cannot sacrifice virtue. But another interpretation is that he just has a sophisticated understanding of virtue, where virtue requires sacrifice, but not the ultimate sacrifice. And this is one way in which we can read him. Now, finally, I wanted to say something about the pleasure of reading political philosophy through a novel. So, of course, I guess if you're coming to it as a page turner, it's more contemplative than that. But it's a brilliant read. And I think it fits perfectly the hesitation about reform that I encountered in there. Because often if political philosophers are unsure in what direction exactly to move, through which steps, they end up adopting purely critical stance. So they end up criticizing those who suggest reforms. But he avoids that, and he avoids that because he offers as a protagonist who is searching for a question here. And that protagonist is allowed the leeway of trying to come up with solutions that are imperfect. And when the protagonist's faults are made apparent to us, as some amusing passages about the faults of the protagonist, we believe them, whereas we're a political philosopher writing in the standard mode to say, well, I have my faults, we might think, well, this is strategy or something that is meant to manipulate us. I think that is the space that the novel brings, puts aside these type of concerns and allows us to trust more the hesitation that we encounter. That's it.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Sophia, for, I found that very illuminating, not just because you deal with the substance of the book, but also the mode and the way in which that affects our reception of what Radishev is or is not trying to tell us. Perhaps it's a good moment to ask Andrew and Irina, would you like to respond to any of those points? Perhaps start with Andrew. It looks like you're waiting to say something.
Those are very, very interesting comments, and they're refreshing as well, because this is a book whose reception has been very, very politicized. Once it was published in the Soviet Union, and the view on whether Radishev is a reformer or an abolitionist, whether this is a novel or it's a treatise, whether in fact, if it is a treatise, why is it written in such an odd way? These have been questions for less debate, I think, than for assertion. So I think it is very good, actually, to have an open-minded discussion of them. I think I really appreciate the sensitivity with which you've thought about his predicament as an author. And at a time, and as Irina said, he had the best years of Catherine's reign in so many ways, in some ways. And as you said, perhaps he was taken aback by the very, very harsh reprisals he faced. I think perhaps one answer to the question why he was treated so harshly may actually lie in this question of who is responsible for corruption. So one chapter of the journey is called Projects for the Future, and it recounts an allegorical dream about a ruler who has become blinded to truth by corrupt courtiers, and cataracts grow over the ruler's eyes that can only be removed by a wise visitor. I think implicitly the question is whether this is an allegory of Catherine and whether that danger had already befallen her in Radishev's judgment. Well, by the time he wrote the book, Radishev had seen the Russian state up close, at court and in its administration. He also was aware that there had been hundreds of peasant rebellions, not just the Pugachev rebellion, but many minor rebellions. He was also aware that Catherine had, despite all the judicial reforms, she had only severely punished one notorious landowner, and really for symbolic purposes. So I believe that he shared the ambition of Catherine the Reformer. And I think the phrase pragmatic enlightenment was made for a ruler like Catherine, whose legislative packages targeted social welfare, but he understood the limits of her power to implement her best ideals. And the book, I think, reveals that although she is absolute, in fact, she isn't at all. And so her claim, and the claim made on her behalf by European intellectuals like Voltaire, was that she was not a despot in the Oriental sense, but an example of an enlightened ruler compatible with Josephism and its own way. Her rule was a rebuke to the French style of autocracy. And there are histories of micro-regional histories about reform that took place. Radishev knew that serfdom was not an ancient economic structure, but recent. He knew that it was therefore reformable. But while some Russians had concluded that serfdom was economically inefficient, and Catherine wanted to see the landlords invest their profits in the land by incentivizing serfs to work harder with better conditions under modernized estate management, corruption was a scourge, as was expenditure on luxuries, largely imports. The empire was too large to police. The judiciary was hard to ring fence from corruption. He's not the only Russian right of the period to pin the blame for corruption on the gentry, but he may be unique in showing concern not only for the victims of corruption, but for the moral damage corrupt individuals sustained. And so I think what he brought into question was he showed that even a ruler with a sense of virtue is working in a pyramidal structure of the Russian state with a small set of highly powerful families at the apex. And this was a cause for pessimism and radical thinking. And he does, there's a wonderful passage in which he says, don't be alarmed, do not be alarmed as someone rooted in corruption, having grown grey in the embraces of shamelessness, walks past you and despises you. Do not attempt in vain to hinder his progress with the pleasure of your conversation. His heart is already stone. I think that might be one of those passages that Zosha has in mind when the narrator himself understands his own flaws and interrogates his moral intentions, but is working in a world where many people no longer do that. So I think that, that's part of the offense of the book, that it didn't gild the lily in any way. Those were the comments I wanted to make on that point. I think, Irina, I was going to say a few things perhaps about pessimism, but I don't know whether you want to come in on any of on that question.
How about we bringing Irina here? I just want to mention, if we jump forward 45 years, in Gogol's time, exactly the same issues, the same, in his great play about corruption, the Inspector General, and then Dead Souls, which poses the same questions. Is he arguing for the abolition of serfdom through this novel or not? It's debated with similar ferocity, or is he hoping for some kind of fundamental reform, which seems to be your argument, Andrew, as I understand it. Irina, would you like to respond to some of Zosha's comments?
Yeah, maybe we can take turns with Andrew. Yes, thank you, Zofia, for your many very interesting observations and for reading our book so with such a friendly and discerning eye. I would like to engage with some of your points. The social contract, of course, as a political philosopher, Radishev shared this belief in social contract with other philosophers of enlightenment. At the same time, he was a very serious student of history, of Russian history, not only Russian, but Russian in particular. He very carefully studied several major works on Russian history and also historical sources. The Chronicle, the Russian law code, so-called the Russian justice, first put together in the 12th century. He took copious notes, and the description of the fall of Novgorod in the journey actually comes almost verbatim from his historical notes. He discovered what he thought was an evidence that old Rus, old Russia political system had a working mechanism to maintain the social contract, the contract between princes and the populace. You may remember in the description of the fall of Novgorod that the description of the fall of Novgorod ends with the words, and I quote from the translation: "There was a bell in Novgorod, to the sound of which the people gathered at the Veche, or General Assembly, to consider public affairs. Tsar Ivan confiscated the bell of the Novgorodians," end of quote. And that was the end of Novgorodian history. What Radishchev meant here was that on this assemblies in Novgorod and in his mind, also in many other old Russian cities, people decided, among other things, whether they want to continue their contractual relations with the princes. And when they did not want to continue them, they broke them and kind of drove the princes, dismisses the princes, drove them away. Radishchev thus believed that there was a working mechanism to regulate and enforce the social contract. The mechanism was lost for various reasons, but since it existed in his mind, there was hope for its kind of restoration. So this is my kind of addition to what is known about his Radishchev's ideas in this area. About the problem, the so-called problem of transition. How do you get from this unjust society to the perfect society? And for Radishchev, it was a problem. He did not believe that human nature was all good. He was thinking seriously about how to change, to reform human nature, and thus how to move people to change. And his solution was to affect human sensibility, to awaken man's ability to feel and then to change himself and then change the society. Recall what is said in the dedication to the book. Again, I quote: "I glanced about myself. My soul became lacerated by the suffering of humanity." And later, "Remove the veil from the eyes of natural feeling, and I shall be blissful." This voice of nature resounded loudly in my sensibility. I arose from the desolation into which the capacity to feel and empathy has cast me. I sensed within myself sufficient strength to resist the error, and ineffable joy. I sensed that everyone had the ability to be co-participant in doing good for those like himself. This is the thought that prompted me to write what you are about to read. So he actually believed in the power of art, the power of literature. And the book that we are discussing today was meant to effect change. It is crucial that the change begins with understanding Radishchev's views, that the change begins with an individual, with the individual's ability to see and feel, or rather co-feel. He is very particular about this kind of empathic moment of feeling, sympathizing. And the change in individuals would cause social change. This also answers the question, I think, why to write fiction and not political treatises, although he did write them as well. And essays, treatises do not affect emotions, while fiction does. Maybe I will pass
yes.
to Andrew again.
No, thank you. Thank you very much, Irina. Precisely perhaps on this point, that we need change in the individual before social change. And of course, we can think of Tolstoy too later in that tradition. But Zofia, would you like to respond to Andrew or Irina's responses to your comments, as it were? Is there anything you'd like to add to that?
No, I think they were just great. There's just so much else to discuss, right, that we're about to do. So,
okay, fantastic. So perhaps Andrew, over to you on the question of pessimism or whatever else you would like to talk about.
Well, if you think there's time, because we want to hear from the audience if people have questions. I can say something speak for 2 minutes on the question of pessimism. Shall I?
Do please. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I quoted, or I believe I quoted earlier Catherine's instruction, which the opening line of which is Russia is a European state. And that foundational document of her reign drew heavily on the spirit of the laws of Montesquieu. She was a devoted reader of Montesquieu. When it came to contract theory and social contract, of course, she was well aware of Rousseau, but she hated Rousseau, not surprisingly. But Radishev, of course, and Radishev is not the only Russian intellectual of the period to be fond of Rousseau. But I think, the question of whether Russia was a European state led Radishev, in this text, but elsewhere, to explore the question of history and whether history inclines to pessimism, or rather to a poor outcome or a better outcome. And I think Irina gave the example and spoke very eloquently about the chapter on Novgorod. In another work, The Historical Song, which is a vast historical poem he wrote in 1801 after he returned from exile and the year before his suicide, Radishev turned to antiquity and he narrated the decline of the Athenian Republic into the tyranny of the Roman Empire. So his reading of Montesquieu and his late suffering had led him to reconsider the relation between forms of government and historical progress. So while Catherine thought Russia was a European state, and Radishev thought so too, at least culturally, he seems to have concluded that by virtue of its size and structure, Russia, like the Roman Empire, might be consigned to despotism. And influenced by the history of the American colonies, and I think we know now that he was aware of the Bill of Rights, he probably read the Bill of Rights, he was persuaded that only federations could work, and he may have believed that only small countries can be ruled by the plebs. Possibly following Montesquieu, who says that a republic can only survive if it remains in a small territory, which is a point made in the Federalist Papers, number 14. In another one of his long poems, the 18th century, he subscribes to a view of history as cyclical, in which empires rise and decline, but can also revive again. So Russia, as described in this journey, is somewhere on the way up or somewhere on the way down. So I think it really, really depends. But the book may end on a note of hope or a mixed note. Its final chapter occurs at the postal station named Black Mud. Not very promising. But its subject is a eulogy to Mikhail Lomonosov, a towering polymath and great scientist, geologist, chemist, and literary theorist, as well as a poet. And he seems to be saying, by leaving the reader at this point, that a century that has produced such a figure has not gone wrong, at least not entirely. And he puts a man of science and art and not a ruler on a pedestal. And that, I think, seems to me to be of importance at the very end.
Fantastic. Thank you. We've got a question here from Nicholas Kronk, a question that I myself also wanted to ask Andrew and Irina. What are the particular challenges that this text poses to the translation? If I can add a kind of addendum to that, did your view of the text change through the process of translating it? I know that this is a text you knew very well already, of course. Who would like to come in?
I think Irina must go first here.
Okay, I can do that. Well, of course, we mentioned the idiosyncratic style of the book, and probably this was the most challenging aspect, particularly that we wanted to let the reader know that the language is idiosyncratic, right? The first translation that was published in, I guess, 57, was very, very able translation. There's, absolutely, and it has like great apparatus. If you want to read the notes, you can, well, it's out of print, of course, but if you can get your hands on this book, it is a good book, but it totally, entirely disregards the book's style. And we didn't want to do that. We wanted to get across that it is a book, a book of art and fiction, not a period, not an essay, not that the language is supposed to be part of the message, as I was trying to argue a little bit earlier. So this was the most difficult thing. We needed to find a fine balance between readability and the signal to the reader that this is a strange book. It is supposed to be strange. So we had to compromise a little bit. I guess I started with the idea that you can almost transcribe the strangers into the English language. And Andrew probably started with the idea that we should not do that at all, but then we were able to work out the middle ground. How successfully, that's for you to judge, of course. And Andrew, if you want to continue.
No, I think Irina's described the challenge and our combined, our joint thought. I think my perception of translation changed. Because I'd done other translation projects, but this presented a whole new type of challenge. And it also felt in a funny way redemptive, because Radishev has been badmouthed by lots and lots of Russian literary scholars who find the style very just impenetrable. And so the message of the book has always been sort of extracted without, I think, proper appreciation of its literariness, all of the things that Irina mentioned. So we had to steer a fine line, and we did that partly by thinking holistically. At the beginning, we thought, well, perhaps let's avoid all words in English that seem to have a French derivation origin, because they seem too smooth. And Radishev's the opposite end of the spectrum in Russian literature of the period is Karamzin, who writes in a smooth style. That's often thought of as a Russian imitation of the French vernacular or French educated speech. So that let's avoid all Gallicisms, French syntax. Let's go more for an Anglo-Germanic vocabulary base. And punctuation, subordinate clauses, we really had to look at everything. But even at the proof stage, I recall there was, for instance, take one example, we had Radishev coins these words that are clearly meant to be alienating, such as, what was it, Svishena Slujitsa or something like that, which is not priest, but servant of religion. So we thought that the correct word was hierophant, hierophant. And I think either the copy editor or a reader, maybe a reader, because the book was read, we had two readers, said, no, you mustn't use hierophant. And we we stuck to our guns because it was a small example. So I think the citation that Oliver mentioned mentions, readable but with bumps. So if you encounter funny words like, hierophant, but Oliver, as a distinguished translator of Dostoevsky, is well familiar with the problem of certain idiosyncratic phrases and turns of speech. So I think I learned a lot about translation, and also doing the verse translation was great fun in verse form. We are the first to have done that. The previous translation didn't really make an attempt at all.
This is Andrew's achievement.
Uh-oh. No, it was both of ours. It was both.
He was a poet, but
it's also one of the many features of this very rich book that we haven't managed to talk about. Of course, we haven't managed to fit everything into 1 hour, and that's that it is a mixed genre book, that it doesn't include lengthy sections of verse. Another feature, which I think wouldn't have come through from our discussion, but although we planned to speak about it if there were time, is that this is a very intimate book as well. I mean, we talked about the flaw, the narrator being prepared to sort of share his flaws, and that, that's also
I think Oliver is afraid to say sex.
No, but it relates to it relates to the sex. We've already talked about that in terms of its very negative portrayal in terms of Trois de Seigneur, as you mentioned.
Yeah.
But it's also there as a theme in a way that I didn't recognize in Russian literature of that period. I mean, one of the most intimate books of recent Russian literature, which is an acknowledged classic, is Yerofeyev's Moskva Petushki, Moscow to Petushki. And I always thought that must be in some parodic relation to this book, because that deals with one character's journey from Moscow to a tiny little station outside. But it's more than just a sort of parody or an allusion. Actually, both these texts are, as I say, very kind of intimate. They take us into a very personal feelings and physiological realities as well. Not so much sex in the case of Yerofeyev, but drinking. Anyway, that's a digression. But there are many other aspects we haven't touched on. One thing I would like to end on, and to sort of loop back to the current situation, is the question of how this book fits in to the imperial or anti-imperial tradition in Russian literature. And of course, we're being made to think about that very strongly by what's happening right now, but we're also thinking about it more generally in terms of creating new syllabuses for Russian literature because of more general cultural movements underway in all universities. I mean, I don't know who wants to talk about this, Radishev's view of Empire Russians, imperial, his own anti-imperial views. I know that Zosha has things to say about this, and Andrew too, but perhaps we can go around in turn, and we don't have very much time left, but briefly to get your thoughts on this. If Zofia, if we start with you, perhaps.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting that clearly the author is in some shallow respect a beneficiary of imperialism, not morally beneficiary, but in some other sense beneficiary. And yet I thought it was an extremely clear condemnation of imperialism damaging everyone inside the state. So he emphasizes the blood sacrifice that it takes, but then goes on to tell us how it basically doesn't benefit anyone at all. And it was very clear.
I agree with that. I would also add that I think it's a very intersectional book. So he sees global empire, I think, in global terms, because he's very interested. Edward Said read a famous analysis of Jane Austen in which he said, "Oh, we think these books are apolitical, but Jane Austen is very attentive to sugar and plantations and whatnot." And I think for Radishev as well, he asks about the cost of luxury and the corruption of luxury. And, there's a wonderful caricature but grotesque episode of a politician, a political figure who must have his oysters on time. And Radishev describes the whole sort of food production and what it takes to source these, at what cost. And of course, people who are implicated in providing these luxuries themselves are cowed and become corrupt. So,
and he thinks about this himself when he's drinking his own cup of coffee, doesn't he?
He does indeed. I mean, I should turn over to Irina, but of course,
we do need to wrap this up. So if we do that right now, and then we'll bring the discussion to a close. Irina, if you've got any final thoughts on.
Right. Always to what Sophia says and Andrew says, I just want to remind you that the word and the idea of imperialism did not exist at his time. He did condemn, he does condemn all kind of foreign conquests, right? But he didn't, I'm not sure he was thinking in the terms that are, familiar to us. And I think we should remember that not modernized his thinking.
Thank you. That's a very important.
That he was against, conquest.
Thank you. I think that's a very important scholarly qualification. Right. So it just remains to say thank you to the people who've hosted, to the institutions who have hosted this discussion, to Torch, to the Harriman Institute, the Columbia University Press, Russian Library, and above all, thank you to the panelists for this very productive discussion. We'll end it there. But do come along to the next book at lunchtime. Thank you.
Thank you. Hello?
Yes.
Someone has written, oh, interestingly, about, okay. Can you see the Q&A? There's an interesting comment about J.M.R. Lenz.
Right. He was, yes, a prominent Mason.
Yeah, absolutely.
And we didn't mention that Radishchev probably.
No, we did.
Was
I think that, yeah, I think that was my fault. I just didn't manage to get it in. I should have done. Is that all right, Torch team? Oh, we're still recording. Oops.
We're just removing a few more people, sorry.
Right.
Right. So
hang on 1 second, and that's everyone gone. Sorry, there were just still some people in the Zoom room, so I was just removing those, as I said. So Christina, you can bring the slide down now. Thank you, sorry about that.